I thought I had seen every kind of emergency in my career: car wrecks, burn victims, heart attacks. But nothing prepared me for the patient we admitted that night. His name, I'd later learn, was Josh Spence. He arrived soaked, freezing, and unresponsive. But when we checked his lungs, there was no water. His blood work was impossibly normal. Within hours, he was sitting upright, gazing at us with piercing clarity. And that's when the real nightmare began, because nothing in medicine could explain what Josh became or what force seemed to surround him. And I've never spoken of it until now. The trauma doors opened, and the first thing I saw was a man lying on the gurney, lips darkened to a bluish purple, skin pale and wet as if he had been lifted from a lake. His body shook violently with tremors, but the movement didn't fit the cases of hypothermia or drowning I had treated before. There was no frantic gasp for air, no desperate coughing, no water pouring up from his lungs. Instead, he just shivered, his chest rising and falling in an uncannily steady rhythm. Even the paramedics looked unsettled. One of them muttered that they had pulled him from the riverbank, soaking wet, unconscious at first, but with no signs of water inhalation. We all expected damage to his airway, but when I listened to his lungs, there was nothing. Clear as a textbook example of normal. It immediately set my nerves on edge. We began our routine quickly. Oxygen mask applied, line drawn, vitals recorded, and that's when the contradictions piled up. His skin was cold to the touch, his core temperature dropping into territory that should have placed him in deep hypothermic shock. Yet his oxygen saturation flashed across the monitor at 99%. That was impossible. I'd seen patients pulled from much warmer environments who couldn't hold levels anywhere near that. EMS kept checking their notes, certain they missed something. The whole picture felt wrong. He looked like a dying man, but our tools told us he was thriving. Around the bay, nurses exchanged low whispers. Someone suggested a malfunctioning probe. Another checked the pulse oximeter on her own finger to prove it was working. Perfect reading. Back to him. Perfect again. His blood pressure read stable, his heart rate calm, except his skin alone told me he was ice. You don't see that without critical deterioration. Every doctor knows the rhythm. Hypothermia steals function step by step. But for him, nothing advanced, nothing changed. It was as if time had frozen inside him. The room itself added to the strangeness. Monitors gave their standard green glow, heart tones pacing across the screen, oxygen lines stable, no alarms sounding. Usually in post-immersion scenarios, you hear incessant beeps, staff voices raised as things dip and nosedive. Here, silence. The kind of silence where every second feels stretched, where nurses find themselves staring harder at screens than at each other, just waiting for the crash that must come. But it never did, and that absence of alarms started to feel heavier than alarms themselves. I kept circling back to the contradictions like a broken record. Patients pulled lifeless from water arrive with froth in the airway, with aspirated fluid robbing the alveoli of function. Their chests heave like trapped animals, gasping for whatever oxygen they can grab. This man did none of it. No pink foam, no rattling breath, no swelling in the trachea. Instead, he looked suspended, caught between crisis and calm. It reminded me of mannequins used in training, a body arranged to demonstrate a principle, except this one had heat radiating faintly from it and eyes quivering beneath closed lids. And that raised the doubt I didn't want to say out loud. Was this man actually hypothermic at all? Or was something wearing that appearance like clothing, mimicking the surface while the inside obeyed different laws altogether? Medicine depends on patterns, and none of ours applied here. Dr. Rita Franks, my colleague, caught my glance and shook her head in the smallest way, as if to say she saw the same contradiction. Neither of us spoke it aloud, but in that moment, theories about lab error or faulty monitors collapsed. We both knew we were staring at something medicine couldn't quantify. Then, as if to seize on that exact thought, his eyes opened. Slowly, No sudden gasp, no confusion, no fight for air like resuscitated patients so often display. Just a gradual lifting of the eyelids, the bluish face turning calm, those clear pupils finding mine almost instantly. He didn't blink, didn't groan, didn't attempt to sit up. He only watched, not like a patient returning from unconsciousness, but like someone who had been aware of us the entire time, waiting for the moment to show it. That gaze, steady and untroubled, was the point when the nightmare began. Because in his eyes I recognized not relief, not fear, but recognition, like he had found what he was looking for. And that single look carried me and Dr. Franks into territory where medicine had no footing at all. When Josh first sat upright, it wasn't with the confused fumbling I'd expect after a collapse. His movements were clean, calm, deliberate. He opened his eyes and fixed them directly ahead, as if already oriented. Not a single word came out, not even the weak groan most patients give when they first regain consciousness. He looked at us, blinked once, and then sat with unnerving stillness, as if gauging how we would react. That silence had a weight to it, and in those first minutes it felt heavier than any alarm could. As the minutes stretched, his eyes never softened, never wandered toward the fluorescent lights, never flickered with drowsiness. He traced us carefully. When a nurse crossed to the supply cabinet, his gaze followed the entire way. When I reached for his vitals chart, he tracked my hands like someone cataloging details. Usually patients, especially silent ones, dart their eyes in confusion or focus on a single familiar object to ground themselves. He did not. He studied every person in the room with exact precision. None of us wanted to admit it, but it felt like we were being evaluated. The staff started whispering when they thought I couldn't hear, but everyone knew. The silence grew heavier with each passing quarter hour. In medicine, quiet patients make doctors nervous. It usually means a worse condition hides beneath faint symptoms. But Josh wasn't deteriorating. His numbers remained bafflingly perfect. His silence didn't fit any known pattern. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't shock. It was choice. That choice unsettled every person who entered the bay. I proceeded with baseline neurological testing, hoping for some clarity. I shined a penlight into each pupil. They constricted instantly, even faster than average. I tugged lightly on his limbs. His resistance was strong, almost excessive, like he was showing me more force than was required. Finger to nose, heel to shin, movements that should reveal instability in trauma patients, all came back flawless. What unsettled me more was that each reaction seemed slightly exaggerated, too precise to interpret as passive compliance. It felt rehearsed, like he had read the exam manual and wanted to prove he could outperform the standard. The discomfort crept over me slowly, but it stayed lodged in my chest. Every year of practice had taught me how to map symptoms to pathways. Speech delays, limb weakness, confusion, uneven reflexes. Each had protocol, but I had nothing that explained a man who should be dying of exposure while demonstrating a neurologic exam stronger than many healthy volunteers. It was the first time my training felt like it was eroding underneath me, as if the rules themselves were breaking one by one. Dr. Rita Franks hovered near the foot of the bed, her eyes narrowing the longer Josh refused to speak. She leaned in close during a lull and murmured that silence, this exact, this controlled, couldn't be blamed on injury. He was holding back, not incapable. No missing phonation, no damage to the vocal cords. As far as we could tell from his breathing, no sign of impaired cognition. Only endurance and quiet. She was right. He wasn't silent by accident. He wanted us to feel that gap. Over the following hours, his responses shifted from obedience to subtle control. When I asked if he knew his name, he didn't nod or shake his head. He shifted his gaze, long and direct, to the ID bracelet on his wrist, then back to me. When a nurse asked if he felt pain, he closed his lids once and then reopened them, prolonging the blink until every second dragged. Not yes, not no, just a gesture heavy with intention, as if designed to demand interpretation rather than give answers. In effect, he was dictating how much we were allowed to know. The more time passed, the louder the mundane details became. The hum of the fluorescent tubes seemed to dip in and out of pitch. The tick of the wall clock became dominant in the room, louder in perception than it should have been. And always his stare rested with deliberate weight. Machines around him traced steady lines, heart rhythm strong, oxygen saturations impossible for his presentation. He looked cold, but breathed warm, sat upright, and endured. The monitors reassured, but my own instincts refused. It was Rita who finally voiced what none of us wanted to. She stood nearer to him, watching his face just as closely as he had been watching all of us, and then whispered to me, "He's not mute. He's choosing not to speak." Her words chimed against the steady rhythm on the screens, and in that instant everything crystallized. Josh's silence wasn't emptiness, it was pressure. It was choice layered on top of control. And that made his presence more threatening than any trauma case could have. Every test we ordered looked flawless from the start, so flawless it carried a kind of staged quality. The initial blood panel printed out with clean numbers across the board. Liver enzymes, electrolytes, kidney function, all perfectly where they should be. Chest x-ray showed clear lungs, no fluid accumulation, nothing to suggest trauma. Head CT read normal without even minor swelling. It was textbook, and yet the man lying in front of us looked anything but healthy. His skin was pallid and damp, his core temperature dangerously low by our measurements. I kept waiting for a single abnormal flag to guide us, but none came. It grew stranger the more testing we ran. The second round of labs repeated the same. Every marker we used to identify stress in the body came back within normal limits. White count unraised, blood clotting factors unaltered, no sign of acidosis. Disease wasn't hiding anywhere in his blood. Physically, he wore the presentation of a body under duress. On paper, he looked like the healthiest patient to enter the bay that night. It was a rift between what my eyes saw and what the numbers claimed, and that rift only widened as the night progressed. Machines are a physician's anchor when instinct wavers, but that night they betrayed us. The blood analyzer locked mid-process and rebooted without warning. Temperature probes reset themselves during reads, spitting out error messages at the height of recording. Monitors froze only when recording his vitals, then cleared the moment they were switched to another patient. Data we tried to log into the system appeared blank on entry. At first we blamed the equipment, but it quickly became too frequent, too centered. The moment that sealed it for me came at 3:36 a.m. We calibrated 2 different thermometers simultaneously, one digital probe attached to his side and one ear canal scanner. Both ran at the same time, both generated a reading in 2 precise numbers. The ear canal displayed a dangerously cold result, consistent with a man barely able to remain conscious. But the body probe, only inches away, clashed completely, showing a reading 1 full dozen degrees higher. An impossible split. 2 machines, 2 readings at the same moment, neither agreeing. Nurses glanced at each other in silence, the kind that says no one knows what to say next. By then, fear was bleeding through the staff more openly. Someone muttered that the probes needed recalibration. Another scolded that no 2 devices malfunction like that in sync. The tension at bedside snapped into arguments over procedure, voices sharper than necessary. I noticed how every exchange carried not just frustration, but something deeper, dread masked as anger. None of us wanted to admit we were losing trust not just in our tools, but in our environment. Rita, standing closest to Josh's bedside, finally cut through everyone's arguing. Her words landed flat but heavy. What if this body isn't operating on our rules? It dropped into the space like stone into water. No one answered. We all stood, eyes flicking between screens that held steady lines and a man who sat watching without expression. And as if in response to her words, the fluorescent lights trembled faintly overhead. They didn't burn out, just flickered 2 times, steadying again only once his gaze shifted from her to the ceiling. The heart monitor chimed in sync with each shake of the bulbs, as though his silent focus resonated with our entire system. We moved to document it all, but the systems themselves turned on us. Patient notes entered into his electronic record appeared empty when we saved them. Charts registered the right author but contained blank fields. Time signatures reversed order, a 352 entry listed before 347. Other patient files opened clean, uncorrupted, and untouched. Only Josh's record bore the scars of whatever was happening, and when the IT technician checked the console, she delivered a clipped explanation: system corruption in a local file. Nothing unusual, just reboot and re-enter. But standing there, listening, I noticed the pattern. It was only his file, only his numbers, his notes, his scans. Everywhere else, the hospital ran without flaw. All errors traced back to Josh alone. That was when the room shifted in my mind. The hospital had always represented control, a structured place where evidence guides response. But as the hours passed, that reassurance unraveled. What surrounded Josh didn't match clinical law or computer glitch. The failures weren't background noise, they were targeted moments that made the environment feel no longer ours. It was becoming his space, his system, his control. And standing there as machines hummed against his steady gaze, I realized we weren't testing a patient anymore. We were inside something he allowed. Words failed in that realization because nothing in the textbooks prepared us. The monitors swayed between normal and unreadable, the lights shuddered, records bent against time. We clung to the rituals of medicine, but I knew in that moment that medicine no longer held jurisdiction. The hospital was sliding under a rule none of us understood, a rule Josh seemed to hold quietly with every deliberate breath. Hours into his stay, Josh finally moved his lips, not to form words, but to stretch them into a smile. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, deliberate, like he wanted us to notice it all at once. His expression carried an almost calm certainty, as if he owned the moment more than anyone else in that room. I remember standing at the foot of the bed, the monitors still running their perfect lines, and realizing that this was the moment we had all been waiting for. The still patient we'd studied for hours wasn't unresponsive at all. He was aware, very aware, and now he was showing it. His eyes were the next thing to change. They locked on me, steady and intrusive. They were a sharp, unnatural shade of blue, so piercing that it felt like the color pressed in deeper than his gaze itself. They didn't reflect the soft fluorescent tones around us. They seemed to hold their own light, brighter against the pallor of his skin. What unsettled me most was the intention behind them. He wasn't just making eye contact. He was holding it, gripping it, keeping me from even considering a glance elsewhere. Dr. Franks noticed it too, her posture stiffening as if every hair on her neck had lifted at once. We started asking questions again, pushing him, hoping his movements meant communication. But instead of speaking, his mouth shifted silently, forming shapes that matched the rhythm of questions we hadn't even finished asking. Before I could ask if he remembered how he had gotten to the riverbank, I caught his lips making the shape of the word remember. When Rita spoke, asking if he felt pain, I saw the faint outline of pain cross his mouth before she even finished the sentence. He wasn't answering, he was anticipating, or more disturbingly, already knowing. That silence deepened as Rita leaned closer, testing him further. Her hands rested lightly on the rail, only a foot away from his face. I saw her freeze mid-breath. Later she swore to me that she heard her name. She insisted a faint whisper passed from his lips, not loud enough for me to hear, but precise enough for her to feel it cut through the noise around us. The fraction of a smile on his face never faded. He didn't repeat it, didn't show effort. Just that small shift in expression, like he enjoyed the effect, Just after that, everything in the room plunged into darkness. All at once, the lights snapped out, the hum of machinery vanished, and a chorus of alarms shrieked against the silence. Nurses called out. Someone dropped a clipboard. For 3 full seconds, the ER felt emptied of every ounce of control. Then the lights surged back again, harsh and sterile, the glow searing against newly wide eyes. Every monitor rebooted into life. And there was Josh, sitting exactly where he had been, calm, collected, with that smile broadened into something closer to a smirk. The sensation that hit me then wasn't fear in the usual sense. It was the raw, invasive feeling of exposure. For too long, I had thought we were observing him, charting him, scanning him. But in his eyes, I felt something else. It was as if a hand flipped through the pages of my mind, browsing through my life without my permission. Memories surfaced that had nothing to do with medicine, childhood images, personal guilt, moments I thought private. When Rita caught my eye across the bed, I knew she felt it too. Neither of us spoke, but our faces shared the same recognition that we were being read. Finally, I snapped, demanding to know who he was. Rita repeated the question, firmer this time. His face shifted slightly, and for the first time since arrival, sound formed from his mouth. One word. Names. His voice was steady, low but clear, and was enough to cut through every machine's hum. We waited for more, but nothing followed. He let the word drag out in silence after it ended, like punctuation set to throw everything into doubt. The silence pressed heavier than the sound. One word was all he needed, and he seemed to know that its lack of context would hit harder than any explanation. That single uttered word confirmed everything we had suspected. He wasn't incapable of speech. He wasn't impaired. He understood language, and he understood identity. More than that, he wielded it, dropping a single fragment at just the right moment to dismantle our entire sense of control. It wasn't hopeful progress in a patient's recovery. It was proof that he operated by a knowledge far beyond our reach. When he let his smile fade back into neutrality, we knew something irreversible had shifted. Medicine had failed to confine him to its patterns. He had no intention of letting us probe or fix him. The terrifying truth, sitting heavy under that fluorescent hum, was undeniable. We had spent hours trying to diagnose a man who was never a patient. He wasn't here to be saved. He was here watching, studying, and choosing what to reveal, and I felt certain in my bones that it was only the beginning of what he wanted from us. When morning shift walked in, they expected the usual routine of sign-outs and patient updates. Instead, the bed where Josh had been the entire night sat completely empty. His gown was folded on the chair. His wristband, the one I had clipped in place myself, was gone. The IV was disconnected with clean precision, not discarded, not hurried, absent, as if it had never been there. His chart no longer sat on the counter. I remember staring at the vacant stretcher, still dented slightly from his weight, and feeling an odd certainty that he hadn't walked out in any normal way. My first instinct was to check whether he had been formally discharged. No record existed, no signature, no order written by myself or Dr. Franks. Nothing. It wasn't that the process had been bypassed, it had been erased, cleanly, without trace. Hospitals run on documentation, stacks of it, all time-stamped and witnessed, but every trace that Josh Spence had been admitted was gone. Even his admittance slip had disappeared from the intake slot. His presence, which had consumed every second of the night, wasn't reflected on a single sheet left behind. The staff scrambled for answers. A nurse swore she had seen his monitor normal and steady less than an hour before shift change, but when we pulled up the recording, the timeline skipped. 2-minute intervals of missing footage replaced every frame that should have shown him moving. Cameras outside the trauma bay recorded uninterrupted. but the ones focused directly on him carried blackouts that made no sense at all, precise gaps like spliced film. A tech swore the files weren't corrupted, but rather missing altogether, like those seconds had never been captured. When we checked door logs, the story worsened. Our unit locks record every badge swipe with time and name. Not one swipe appeared on either the trauma exit or side doors during the hours he vanished. If someone had carried him, the system would have shown badge use. If he had walked himself out, motion sensors would have tripped alarms. Neither happened. It was as though an invisible corridor had been carved in and out of the building only for him. Detectives came within hours. They asked their routine questions, demanded his file. When I tried to access it from the console, the screen displayed nothing but streams of empty text fields. His chart read only his name, and even that flickered in and out like a corrupted display. The detective insisted something must exist. We showed him every station record. Each looked the same, his data lost or overwritten entirely. He sat with pen poised for a full history, but found himself staring at blank printouts. The weight of disbelief on his face matched our own. The shock rippled through the team. One nurse refused to return for night duty the following week, swearing she had glimpsed the shape of a man lingering in the far hallway after Josh disappeared. Another claimed she heard wet footsteps following her toward the elevator, though no patient was present. Those stories spread fast. Soon, staff traded quiet remarks at the desk, wondering aloud if Trauma Bay 2, where we kept him, had become something more than a room. No one liked entering it alone after dark. My breaking point arrived 2 nights later. I returned to finish leftover chart work. The station where Josh had sat hooked to monitors was cleared, the floor mopped dry. But when I stepped up to the counter, a faint outline caught my eye. One perfect wet footprint rested on the linoleum, too defined to be old, too fresh for someone already gone. It was angled not away from the room, but towards the desk, placed exactly where I had stood to write his notes the night he stared through me. I stopped breathing for several seconds, staring at that mark, realizing it wasn't evidence of movement away. It was a reminder of return. Rita never spoke of it then, but years later she confessed something I had suspected. She wakes from dreams where Josh sits at the edge of her bed. He says nothing. Sometimes he smiles, sometimes only watches. She wanted reassurance, some rational verdict that explained her visions, but I gave her none. I had my own. The conclusion became inescapable. Josh's disappearance wasn't escape. It wasn't even a vanishing in the physical sense. It was erasure. He stripped every trace of his existence from hospital memory, from technology, from paperwork, from the people who witnessed him. The evidence that kept medicine grounded turned to smoke around him. Only our recollection carried weight, only our thoughts marked proof, and those recollections themselves carried wounds instead of facts. That was the last night I worked trauma medicine. Josh's case didn't just mark a turning point in my career, it closed the door on it. Because once you see evidence itself bend, once you witness reality rewritten in front of you, the framework of medicine can't protect you anymore. It wasn't a patient I faced that night. It was something entirely outside of our charge, and it chose to leave us only with scars. Not every patient is meant to be healed. Some arrive to leave behind scars none of us can treat. That night taught me the hardest lesson I've faced in medicine. Not every presence belongs on a chart. Not every case fits protocol. If symptoms defy every instrument, maybe they aren't symptoms at all. Maybe what we met wasn't a patient. It was something else, pretending to be one. If you've witnessed something you can't explain, write it down, keep it safe. Because in my experience, the strangest things aren't forgotten. They erase themselves, leaving only those who remember.